All right, we're in the book of Acts, and today we are looking at lesson 23, which we'll be covering actually about 4 chapters of the book of Acts from chapter 23 to chapter 26. If you remember from our last class, we left Paul under arrest in Jerusalem. He'd been kind of attacked by the mob, and he was rescued by the Roman soldiers, and they were thinking he might be an Egyptian, and then they realized after he spoke to them in perfect Greek, he was not the one they were looking for, and they were trying to figure out who he was. He ended up speaking in Hebrew to the crowd, but then the riots kind of broke out again when he was done, and the soldiers took him to their prison. They were going to examine him by scourging, and Paul, of course, said, is this lawful for you to do since I'm a Roman? And so he used his Roman citizenship to sort of get out of a beating, and now the soldiers and so forth are trying to figure out exactly why he's there. Well, what we find out here in chapter 23, we'll start and we'll look just an overview of chapter 23 to 26, because during this section we're going to really be dealing with Paul in custody before he actually goes on his trip to Rome. Our last class for this course, we will be looking at Paul's trip to Rome and what happened to him after that. But for right now, we're looking at this time of custody from the time that he was arrested the first time in Jerusalem until he actually begins to make his way toward Rome. And the thing we'll find is from this point on in the book of Acts, at least, Paul is going to be under some form of arrest in some prison or another for the rest of the book of Acts. And so we'll be, or I shouldn't say one prison or another, some form of custody or another. We'll talk about the different types of custody that the Romans had a little bit later. But we'll be starting off by looking at Paul appearing before the Sanhedrin, because the soldiers wanted to bring him there to find out what was going on. And he was going to be kind of put before the Sanhedrin. Paul experienced a plot to kill him, which we'll see shows a great deal about what the corruption was in the religious systems of the day. Paul was sent to Caesarea for trial, get him out of town if they could for his own safety. And then he appeared before a man by the name of Felix. Felix was not a very good leader and postponed his decision, hoping to get a bribe from Paul. So for 2 years, he kind of sat in prison without really a trial, without charges being brought against him. Paul appealed to Rome when he realized that in the final analysis they were going to send him back to Jerusalem. He didn't want to go there. He knew he wouldn't get a fair hearing there, and they'd probably try to kill him there. And so he appealed to Rome, and then he will appear once again before Agrippa. Even though it didn't change the fact that he would go to Rome, another leader would hear his story and hear his testimony. Let's start off in chapter 23. Actually, we're going to read from the last verse of chapter 22. So we see where Paul was left off there. Acts 22, verse 30. The next day, he's in this prison now. The next day, he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews. This is the commander that has taken him under arrest. And he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all of their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So he's going to be appearing now before the Sanhedrin. And the primary reason here is that the commander himself is trying to figure out what are these charges that have been brought against him. So letter A, we're finding that the meeting of the Sanhedrin was filled with confusion. And I'll read the first 10 verses here of chapter 23. A great story really about Paul before this group of people. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Well, they didn't like the way that Paul had lived. He said he had lived with good conscience. So basically he said, I'm innocent of everything. I'm right with God and all this kind of stuff. And the high priest Annas commanded those who stood by to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him in as much godly grace as he could, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? So as you can see, Paul never reacted in a negative way to anybody. And those who stood by says, do you revile God's high priest? then Paul says, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil against a ruler of the people. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee and the son of the Pharisees, and concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. What a great word of wisdom this guy had. I mean, here he is. He knows he's not going to get a fair trial. He's reminded of the fact that the Sanhedrin consists of two primary parties, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He was a Pharisee in his past. He was the son of a Pharisee. He referred to himself as a Pharisee of the Pharisees when it comes to his past. So he believed everything that the Pharisees believed. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees had their pet doctrinal differences. And the doctrinal differences was that the Sadducees were the liberals and the Pharisees were the conservatives, and the Pharisees believed in the literal interpretation of the Scripture. The Pharisees were more figurative, and the Pharisees didn't believe in the supernatural. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in miracles. They didn't believe in some of these kinds of, and the resurrection of the dead, which, of course, as you all know, is why they were Sadducees. But, nonetheless. So Paul perceived, I think it was like God dropped this idea into his heart. And so when he declares this statement, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of the Pharisees, concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So he pushed their hot buttons, and instead of now attacking Paul, they're attacking each other again, which was one of their favorite things to do anyway when Paul wasn't around. So when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees say there is no resurrection, no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, we find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let's not fight against God. He's on our side now. Now when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him to the barracks. So they had to rescue him once again from the mob, and this time it was the mob of the Sanhedrin. Let's just go through the notes here quickly. Letter B, the various occurrences in this chapter of Paul's life highlight the corruption in both religion and politics. We'll see more of the corruption in religion in this instant. Later on, we'll see a little bit more of the corruption in the political arena. But number one, there was corruption in the Sanhedrin, or among the religious leaders. First of all, we see that Paul was struck when he was just simply answering their questions. Now, it was customary to treat impudent witnesses this way. I mean, if a witness was being sassy or impudent or whatever, they would actually kind of mistreat them. It wasn't the best of judicial systems, I guess. I don't know whether that was their law, but it was their practice in any case. And actually they had a shoe that was fitted with an iron heel that was used for this purpose. And when a witness would make an impudent outburst, they would strike him in the mouth with the heel of this shoe. And it was meant to be a humbling experience, since the shoe was held in low esteem. It was the thing that touched the ground. Ananias was known to be a real difficult man, difficult leader, and there's even some question at this time whether he was the high priest or just the acting high priest. And so Paul, when he says, I didn't even realize you were the high priest, he might have been actually telling the truth, that he wasn't really sure that he was and didn't realize that he was addressing him when he called him a whitewashed wall. But in either case, it tells us a little bit about some of the corruption there. Paul was not an impudent witness. He was only answering the question. So that tells us a little bit about that. Letter B, witnesses were bribed to give false testimony. Of course, we see this throughout with Jesus and with Stephen and different ones that had been brought before the council. Again, there was bribery involved to get people to say things about them that were not strictly true, to sort of bring the process, a legal process, to completion here. Letter C, the party rivalry was more important than justice. They weren't really concerned as much about justice as to whose party prevailed in a given situation. Letter D, there was a lack of concern for the actual truth. They really weren't trying to get to the actual truth. They had a predisposed agenda, and that's how things were going to go, and it really didn't matter what was said or what happened or who testified or who didn't testify. Don't confuse us with the facts. We know what we want to do with this man. And then letter E, they were willing to conspire with thugs to kill Paul. And we saw this earlier in an earlier chapter. We'll also see this a little bit later in Acts 23, verse 12 to 13, and we'll come to that. But they were willing to get involved with, as the King James Version of the Bible says, certain lewd fellows of the baser sort in order to conspire to get rid of Paul. So there was corruption in the religious system. Number two, there was also corruption in the Roman officials, the political leaders of the day. Letter A, they were open to bribes. As we saw we'll see in a later chapter, we saw in a previous chapter where this one man said he got his citizenship by bribing, and then Felix is waiting for Paul to bribe him to get out of prison, and Paul never does. And as a result, he stays there for a long time. Letter B, they used their power for personal gain. We'll see this even more when we get to Acts chapter 24. And then they preferred political favors over justice. They always wanted to do a favor for the Jews, or they wanted to make a certain group of people happy, and so they would punish this man over here who wasn't guilty of anything so that these people could be pleased. So we see corruption among the political systems as well. But letter C, Paul used the corruption to his advantage. He always was able to see the bright spot here. How can we use this? Number one, with the Sanhedrin, he played to their rivalry to accomplish his purpose. He knew that he had no chance of receiving a fair trial. He was looking for a way of escape, but God opened his eyes and reminded him of their differences, and operating on the word of wisdom, he threw the meeting into total confusion, and to get the people that were involved there to go after each other. So that's one way he used their rivalry to his advantage. And number two, with the Romans, he used his citizenship to accomplish his purpose. And so he was able to use the various things to his advantage so that he would live a little bit longer on the earth. Roman number 3 there, Paul experienced a plot to kill him. Letter A, 40 religious zealots hatched a plot to kill Paul. All right, the trial is not working. The Romans are protecting him. It didn't work out so well in the Sanhedrin, but here's 40 people who decide we are going to kill Paul one way or another. Number 1 there, they swore themselves to an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. How many know they're getting kind of hungry right now? They decided to fast until they killed him. I'm sure there came a day where they said, you know what, I think we're going to have to break this fast. It didn't quite work out the way we hoped, but that just tells you how serious they were about this idea of killing Paul. Number 2, they entered into league with the religious leaders to participate in a plot to kill Paul. They would get the Sanhedrin to ask the Romans to send Paul down for another hearing, and then the zealots would ambush him along the way. So it was a conspiracy. We got these guys, these 40 zealots. Hey, we want to kill Paul. We'll do you guys in the Sanhedrin a favor. All we need from you is just invite him to come down for another hearing, and we'll take care of him on the way. Letter B, God encouraged Paul and protected Paul through difficult times. God encouraged Paul that his ministry would go forward to Rome. Paul, I'm sure, is thinking now, what have I got myself into? Here I am in Jerusalem. The place is in an uproar. I'm now sitting here in a Roman jail. What am I going to do? How am I going to finish my ministry? Because he felt that God had called him to minister in Rome. And so while he was here in this prison, God stood by him just like he stood by Stephen. Notice what it says in Acts 23:11. But the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, you must also bear witness of me in Rome." So God's coming to assure him while he's here in prison, and it gives him a word. Listen, Paul, you will bear witness of me in Rome. Well, that was encouraging to Paul, because Paul may have thought, you know what, I shouldn't have come here in the first place. Now I got myself into all this trouble. Now here I am sitting in a Roman jail. what's my chances of finishing my ministry here? And God says, listen, your ministry's not over. You will go to Rome. Now, lots of times when people get prophetic words like this, or a word that God comes and encourages them, that word does not happen immediately. In other words, okay, Paul didn't say, okay, good. I'll be on my way to Rome tomorrow. No, he was going to rot in that jail for a couple of years, and then he was going to be shipwrecked. He would go through a lot of other experiences before he ever got to Rome. But it was a word that he could hang on to during that time when he was feeling like life is out of control. I got no control over my situation. Am I really ever going to be in Rome? So God encouraged him. Secondly, God protected him. Number two, God moved upon Paul's nephew to reveal the plot to Paul and then to the Roman commander. Paul evidently had a nephew. Some people believe that this nephew that he had, which means he also had brothers and sisters, but this nephew that he had may have actually been one of the 40 zealots. If Paul's family had been like he was, that is, just all out for the letter of the law, this young man might have been very, very zealous also. And the reason why he found out about the plot, because he might have been part of it. Although it's no way to know that for sure, but somehow he got wind of the plot. And at some point in time, blood was thicker than water, if you will, and he realized, you know what, that's my uncle that they're going to kill, and I can't go through with this, or I can't let them go through with this. And so he went and revealed the plot. The soldiers found out about the plot, and they decided, you know what, the best thing we can do is get Paul out of this situation. So Roman numeral 4, Paul is sent to Caesarea for trial. The Roman commander Claudius Lysias decided to smuggle Paul out to Caesarea so that he could receive some sort of a fair trial. Letter B, the Roman commander wrote a letter to Felix, the governor of Caesarea, explaining the situation. In Acts 23, verse 25 to 30, he writes this letter. And when you read this letter, it's typical of all these politicians, because when these politicians are writing letters or when they're talking to each other, they make themselves out to be like heroes in this whole process. He talks about how he rescued this Roman citizen and how he did this. He didn't say much about he was ready to beat him. He didn't say much about some of those things, but he reminded him of all the good things he did. So the commander made himself out to be a bit of a hero in this letter, rushing to the rescue of a Roman citizen and not really mentioning the fact that he almost beat him without a trial. So he writes a letter to Felix to let him know that he's coming there for trial. Letter C, Paul received a major military escort to Caesarea for a better hearing. Man, this was quite an escort when you read about it in Acts 23. The escort consisted of 470 soldiers, including 200 foot soldiers, 200 spearmen, and 70 cavalry. That's quite an entourage of soldiers, 470, to take this little man Paul out of town to save him from the Jews. The foot soldiers and the spearmen went as far as Antipatris. Only the cavalry continued all the way to Caesarea. And the escort took place during darkness. They were basically smuggling him out of town. And so Paul must have felt like a pretty important man by now. Can you imagine that? 470 soldiers. That's quite a large group of people. And with them, of course, they carried this letter that was to be delivered to Felix. Letter D, the letter was delivered to Felix. Letter E, Felix agreed to take the case and hold Paul until his accusers arrived for a trial. And so Roman numeral 5, we find Paul appearing before Felix. Letter A, after 5 days, the Jewish accusers arrived in Caesarea with their lawyer. This is kind of interesting because the Jews never fared very well before Roman magistrates. And so I'm sure that the religious leaders of the day were not going to try to speak at a trial that is held in a Roman court. It's one thing to be in the Sanhedrin, that's their turf. Now they're on the Roman turf, and they've got to somehow negotiate this relationship with the Romans. And so they hired a lawyer, or some places refer to him as an orator, because they probably wouldn't have had much of a chance in terms of the trial itself. They used a lawyer because they knew that Jews would never be favored in the Roman courts. The man's name was Tertullus. At least that's the name that's given for him. And Tertullus is not a Jewish name. It is actually it's a Roman name. And so evidently he was somebody that they felt like might be a good liaison to present their case. Maybe they'd get a better hearing. Letter B, Tertullus presented the case against Paul before Felix. And when you read what he said in Acts 24, verse 1 to 9, he's definitely trying to butter up the court. He's definitely using flattery to try to open the door here for himself. Number one there, he definitely tried to persuade the court with flattery. Notice verse 2 to 4 there. When Paul was called before the court, Tertullus spoke for the prosecution. And this is what he said. Most honorable Felix, we are most grateful in all times and places for your wise and gentle rule. We are much aware that it is because of you, and you alone, that we enjoy all this peace and gain daily profit from your reforms. I am not going to tire you with this long speech about how wonderful you are, how great you are, and how much you really mean to us. I beg your kind indulgence in listening to me. I will be as brief as I can. And that might be believable if you didn't know the history. But actually, history records that Felix was a very incapable governor. In fact, the Jews didn't like him at all. Tacitus, who was a secular historian, described him as one who exercised the powers of a king with the mind of a slave. And so all this Tertullus language was not, he hadn't done anything for the nation. Nobody wanted him. Nobody liked him. Nobody cared about him. But we got to butter him up before we try to get what we want out of him. So using flattery in the situation. I mean, that still happens today, I'm sure. But nonetheless, it was an example here of what they're trying to get something from him, and so they'll give him as much praise as they can. That, by the way, that passage I read was from the Message translation. Number two, he placed Paul in a very bad light when he talked about Paul, and here's three ways in which he referred to Paul. He referred to him as a plague. This man is a plague. Number two, letter B, he referred to him as a creator of dissension. And number three, he referred to him as a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So we got a plague, we got a creator of dissension, we got a ringleader of this sect of the Nazarene. All of these, of course, were false and twisted charges. Number three, he presented twisted and false charges against Paul. The only real charge that was actually given before Felix is that Paul tried to profane the temple. Now you can imagine how serious that must have been to the Roman commander. How serious that would be to a Roman governor. Oh, from Caesarea, he profaned the temple in Jerusalem among the Jews, who we don't really care about, don't really like anyway. And so it's like, and why should I care about that? And so, but again, it tells us a little bit about the corruption of government, because really Felix should have just said, you know what, this is a religious issue, has nothing to do with the law. I'm not going to judge in this matter. This man can be freed, he can be released, he can be let go. But that's not exactly what happened. Letter C, Paul was given an opportunity to give defense to the charges. And Paul denied the charges by describing why he was at Jerusalem, what he was doing, and what he was not doing. Here's some of the things that Paul said. Number one, Paul said he was not disputing with anyone in the temple. They had said he was a creator of dissension. He wasn't disputing with anybody in the temple. He wasn't inciting the crowd. He wasn't profaning the temple. And he was not with a multitude of a tumult, or a tumult. That is a crowd of people that he had brought into the temple, which he was accused of. Number two, Paul said that he was in Jerusalem to worship, to bring alms, to bring an offering for the nation, and to be purified in the temple. Now that might have been a mistake, to talk about bringing an offering. Now Felix has the idea Paul's got money. But be that as it may, he was just telling the truth. Number three, Paul indicated that they may have been offended because he belonged to the sect called the Way, which is different than them. And he had said something about the resurrection of the dead. Now, Paul's going to try this again. It doesn't quite work as well in a Roman court. Sometimes God moves and we have a wonderful response because of a supernatural thing God did. Then we try to duplicate it. Didn't quite work this time. That didn't have the same effect. Number 4, Paul challenged anyone who actually witnessed bad behavior on his part to come and testify against him. Well, there wasn't anybody that could do that, and so nobody came forward. There were no additional charges that were brought. Now, again, as I said, probably what Felix should have done is just release Paul, but that's not exactly what he did. Let's read about it in Acts chapter 24, verse 22 to 27. But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, so Felix evidently understood a little bit more about this Christianity thing than maybe some might have thought. But when Felix heard these things, having a more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So basically he postpones a decision. He says, when the commander who arrested him gets here, we'll talk about it. I'll make a decision. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for him or visit him. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given to him by Paul, that he might release him. Therefore he sent for him more often and conversed with him. Why? Because he wanted to give him more opportunities to give money. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. So again, we see the corruption in the government, wanting a bribe, going to give a favor to the Jews, keep him bound, even though there's no reason to keep him bound. And you think with a Roman citizen, he might have had a little bit more concern that he might be in trouble for how he's handling this case. So letter A here on your notes, Felix decided not to decide. He decided not to decide. You know, a lot of times in life we just decide not to decide. But when you decide not to decide, you really made a decision. And there's just no neutral ground here. You just can't let things go. There's no question that he was not excited about this case, and most likely he knew there was nothing to it, but, you know, it was just one of those things. The excuse he gave for the delay was that he was going to wait for the Roman commander to come and verify the charges. But it doesn't appear that this commander ever came, or he ever pursued it, or ever tried to make sure that that happened. And so Paul just kind of sat there in holding. Number 2, he kept Paul in a minimum security situation with liberties. In other words, people could bring support to him, they could visit him, and he was probably not in a dungeon setting. We'll talk about the different kinds of custody that the Romans had here. He may have actually just been chained to a soldier and could move around a little bit. He couldn't leave the city, obviously, or anything like that. But Paul, obviously, they did not view Paul as a tremendous threat or a conspirator or somebody that was going to hurt the empire. He was most likely in some sort of a military custody with a chain. This would happen to him later when he got to Rome as well. So it was more of a minimum security situation. Letter C, Felix wanted to hear what Paul believed. So he'd heard him in the trial. He heard him defend himself at the trial, but he heard him also say that he was a member of this sect called the Way, and he wanted to hear a little bit more about that. He knew something about it, but he wanted to hear a little bit more about it, wanted to hear a little bit more about what he believed in that area. His wife Drusilla knew something also of the sect. She was probably the one who kind of spurred this initial meeting with Paul. They're curious to hear more. And even though Felix seemed to be touched by Paul's discussion, it says he was afraid. I like the way the King James reads here. It says he trembled. It's kind of like he's listening to Paul, and what is Paul talking about? He's talking about righteousness, judgment, self-control. He's talking about these kinds of things. And my thinking is that Felix was starting to get under conviction of the Holy Spirit as he was talking. I've seen this happen to people who were unsaved. They get into an environment where the truth is being explained and things are happening, and they actually almost start vibrating, or literally start vibrating. I've seen people literally do that in the presence of the Lord. And so if he is under conviction, it's interesting because there's different things you can do when conviction comes. Two ways to get rid of conviction. Either yield to it, repent, and ask God to forgive you. That's one way. The other way is to get rid of the person who's causing you conviction. And so he says to Paul, you know what, why don't you just go away for a while? And maybe we'll get together another time and talk about this a little bit more. This is getting too hot. This is getting too heavy. This is getting too personal. Maybe there'll be another convenient time where we can talk about this again. So again, he's kind of a procrastinator. He's a procrastinator in terms of his judgment. He's a procrastinator in terms of what's going on in his spiritual life. Acts 24:25. Now, as Paul reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you." That's the way a lot of Christians are, or people are. I shouldn't say not necessarily Christians. But it's like, okay, when I have a convenient time, then you can present the gospel to me. This isn't a really good time right now for me. Maybe there'll be a better time later. Well, that's just putting it off. And unfortunately, some of them never have that convenient time. Letter D, Felix knew Paul was innocent but wanted a bribe. Well, Paul had talked something about bringing an offering of money to this nation. Well, when you bring an offering to a nation, that's a little different than bringing alms to the poor. An offering to a nation suggests, we're talking about, if I'm going to give money to a nation that's actually going to help a nation, we're not talking about pocket change here, We're talking about a pretty good sum of money. And so, Felix, his ears perked up when he heard that, and he thought, this guy has resources. This guy has a lot of friends, and evidently he's got people that have money, and I could use a little bit of that money. And I'm sure he said to Paul, what can you do to make me happy? Amen. What can you do to make me happy? And but Paul was not going to do that. He was not going to buy his way out of prison. He didn't make any attempt to do that, and I think, again, it shows the integrity of Paul in many ways. He could have just said, well, that's the way things work here. We're just going to do that. And I know many countries of the world today, this is how the only way it seems you can operate is to bribe officials to get them to do what you want them to do. And yet Paul was putting his life in the hands of God, and he said, look, I'm not going to play that game. Letter E, Felix was succeeded by Festus after 2 years. So Paul's been kept in prison for 2 years. In the meantime, Felix is no longer in office, and Festus takes his place. And when Festus comes in, he again leaves Paul bound. When the Roman leaders came in, one of their first concerns, especially if they were in the Palestine area, was somehow to keep the Jews happy and to make friends with them, because we've already understood from our studies in the New Testament that the Jews were not a very easy people for the Romans to lead. They were always at each other's throats, and so they would occasionally try to do favors for them just so that they were in good stead and the people would like them. So basically he left him in prison for the sake of pleasing the Jews, and he wanted to get his tenure as governor off to a good start without just doing something that was totally against what the Jews wanted. Well, in this process, because there's a new governor, maybe the Jews are starting to feel like, we can re-engage this process, and maybe we can go back to our plan A, that is to get Paul to come back down to Jerusalem, and maybe we can get our 40 zealots, if we can find them, if they're not all dead now from starvation. If we can find those 40 zealots, maybe they'll want to do another plot here to kill Paul. And so with the change of leadership in Acts 25, they decide to operate a new plan, letter A. With the change in leadership to Festus, the Jews seized the opportunity to come against Paul once more. And first of all, they made an appeal through a petition to have Paul return to Jerusalem for trial. Secondly, they planned another ambush to kill Paul en route to Jerusalem. And again, it just tells you how corrupt everything was here. They really weren't interested in justice or anything else. They just wanted to get Paul. Letter B, Festus convened a court to listen to the Jews' charges. So, the Jews bring their charges again, and now he has a court to hear what's being said. And Festus was inclined, letter C, to do the Jews a favor and return Paul to Jerusalem for trial. Well, once the trial started going this way, and Paul knew that Festus was going to send him down to Jerusalem, he knew definitely that this would be my last trip to Jerusalem if that was the case. So what did Paul do? Letter D, Paul appealed to Rome to escape from being exported back to Jerusalem. And we read about it here in Acts 25, verse 10 to 12. So Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you know very well. For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. I'm not going into their hands. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. Paul was a little bit of a hot potato. Nobody really wanted to handle him that much. And so, okay, this is an easy out for us. We'll send you the other direction. We'll send you not to Jerusalem. We'll send you to Caesar. At least that gets you out of my jail, gets you off of my chest. And the Jews shouldn't feel too bad about that because I'm keeping him arrested. I'm keeping him in trial. So Paul appealed to Caesar, got Festus off the hook, but also ensured the fact that Paul would not be a free man for another long space of time. So while he's in prison here, he's appealed to Caesar. Okay, he's going to go to Caesar, but that doesn't happen immediately. And while that happens, a man by the name of Agrippa, King Agrippa, and his wife Bernice come to Caesarea, and Paul appears one more time before him. So if you're looking at letter A there, it says King Agrippa and his wife Bernice came to Caesarea and ended up getting involved in Paul's case at the request of Festus. Festus wanted to hear what he would have to say. Letter B, Festus briefed Agrippa on the case. Letter C, Festus indicated that the only charges of the Jews brought against Paul had to do with some religious questions. Notice what he says in chapter 25, verse 18 and 19. And when the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but they had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed was alive. So that's all I know about this. And obviously we're not dealing with a Roman issue here, so it seems to be a religious question. Letter D, Agrippa decided he wanted to hear Paul for himself. And then letter E, Festus also wanted Agrippa to hear Paul because if he was going to send him to Rome, he needed to know what to charge him with. In this section of Scripture, all the way back to when he was first arrested, one of the biggest challenges that the Roman officials have is, what do we charge him with? I mean, this polluting the temple stuff is not going to go over very big in Rome. But what do we? I'm sending a prisoner. I've got to send a letter with this prisoner. What is that letter going to say? And when he's going to trial, what are the charges that we are going to say against him? And so Festus is looking for all the help he can get here. And so he says, King Agrippa, I'd like you to listen to him and see if you can help me. I got to write this letter, and I don't exactly know what to put down. What can we charge this guy with? In Acts 25, verse 24 to 27, and Festus said, King Agrippa, and all the men who are present here with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. Therefore, I have brought him out before you, especially before you, King Agrippa, so that you can, after examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not specify the charges against him. What a struggle to find out, do we have any charges against this? What are we going to say? What are we going to say? I don't know what we're going to say. We can't find anything wrong with him. Well, it's kind of the same boat that Jesus was in. I find no fault with this man, and yet somehow they're going to send him to Rome. So letter F, Paul testified before Agrippa, and so we have actually the third instance or third chapter in the book of Acts that tells us a little bit about Paul's early life. Chapter 9, where it actually all happened to him, and then earlier chapter, I believe it's 22, when he testified to the nation or spoke to the nation about his situation, his background, his upbringing. And now here in Acts chapter 26, where he's testifying again before Agrippa, where he kind of goes through his life story. So when you put those three chapters together, you get Paul's life story as he told it in this chapter. What he did in this particular chapter 26, verse 1 to 23, is he summarized his early life, he recounted his early conversion experience, and he described his ministry of preaching Christ to both the Jews and the Gentiles. And letter G there says, Paul experienced a twofold result from his teaching here. Number one, Festus thought he had gone mad when he was talking about Christ. He was talking about the resurrection, talking about all these things. Festus thought he had gone mad. But Agrippa was almost persuaded to be a Christian. He said, "You've almost persuaded me to be a Christian." So, on the one hand, we have this guy Festus who got tired of hearing what Paul had to say about the faith. He trembled, but he wanted a more convenient time. Here's a guy, Agrippa. He's listening to Paul, and he's not just hearing the facts. He's hearing the heart. And he says, "Man, you've almost persuaded me to be a Christian." But that doesn't quite make it yet. We need to go that extra. Letter H, Agrippa rendered a verdict. And what his verdict was, Paul had done nothing worthy of chains. Number two, had not Paul appealed to Caesar, he might have been set free. And so that was basically the conclusion that he had come to. Now, up to this point in this chapter, we have seen Paul appear before 4 different Roman officials to this point. And this is kind of a summary of their opinions. First of all, there was Claudius Lysias. Claudius Lysias was the commander who arrested him in Jerusalem and was the one who kept him in prison there for a while. He was the arresting officer, and he could not put a specific charge to Paul's apparent offense when he was writing a letter to Felix, to send him to Felix. He was struggling to put some sort of a charge in relationship to him. Then Paul appeared before Felix, the governor of Caesarea, and Felix could find no fault with him, but he kept him in prison hoping for a bribe. So again, no fault, no charge. Then, of course, with Festus coming in as the next governor of Caesarea, he listened to him, and he could find no fault with him and asked Agrippa to help him formulate a charge that would make sense to Rome. So I can't find anything wrong with him. Maybe if you talk to him, you can find something wrong with him. We got to write something down if we're going to send him to Rome. And then finally, Herod Agrippa, the king of the Jews, could find no fault in him and would have let him go, but for the fact that Paul had already appealed to Rome. So you say, well, maybe Paul shouldn't have appealed to Rome. No, he appealed to Rome to save his life. And probably had he not done that, he wouldn't. Well, all this is going to do, it will ensure the fact that Paul gets to Rome. Paul has felt through his whole life that part of his ministry was to go to Rome. And he had spoke about it earlier. We'll talk about that in our next class. Some of the things he had said about it when he wrote to the Roman believers, because that was a period of time quite a bit earlier. And he felt like that was part of God's purpose for his life, was to get to that point. And he would end up getting there. From this point on, we'll see that he starts this trip to Rome. And I know this class today had been kind of going through these trials a little bit detailed, but I think when we get to the next class, we'll see how this whole thing wraps up. And that really, from this point on, and it's not covered this way in most of the books, but you'd have to say that from this point on, Paul starts out on his 4th missionary journey. And I will, even though he's in custody, it is still a missionary journey. You can take, you can take the freedom of a missionary away, but you can't take that missionary spirit, missionary heart away. And even though he is going to be confined, God is going to use him in powerful ways, and ways he probably never could have been used before. And he's going to touch areas where he's never touched before with the gospel that God has entrusted to him. And so even though the last 2 chapters of the book of Acts, Paul will be again completely in custody of the Romans, yet it's going to be remarkable to see how he ministers in that state and how God uses him. It's kind of like Joseph in prison, still rising to the top, still being used of God. However, whatever situation he was in, Paul was who he was by the grace of God. And whether he was confined or not confined, it didn't change who he was as a man of God. And so we'll look at that next time. Let's go ahead and take our 5-minute break here, and we'll come back for the last class.